Good morning, friends. I am Sachin Ketkar from Department of English, MS University, Baroda, and I have with me my friend Dr. Anil Kapoor from RHH Patel Mahila College, Vijapur, Mehsana, and we are going to talk about the distinction between short story and the novel as two narrative forms. And this discussion will be very helpful for you to understand novel and short story as forms that you are studying at your undergrad level college curriculum. So we are going to start now, and we'll first read out the intentions and the objectives of today's discussion, and we will also simplify many of the concepts that we are going to use in our discussion. So let's have a look at the first slide, where we'll be talking about the purpose, the objective behind our discussion. So let's have a look at the first slide.
Well, good morning, Sachin.
Good morning.
Anything should start with an objective, and the first thing is that the students at the undergraduate level should be aware of the different genres that they are studying, and short story and novel, being two genres that use narrative form, are many a times misunderstood because both use story as a basic, let's say, ingredient in it.
Right.
And so today, as we'll be discussing, the students will come to know more about what a short story is. They'll come to know what a novel is. They'll again come to know as to what are the characteristics that define and distinguish these two literary genres. And at the same time, they'll also know about various writers and the works that have contributed to the development of both these forms.
Yeah. So the objectives of the presentations are: you will be able to better understand the notions of genre, narrative, fiction, the short story and the novel. You will be able to tell the similarity and difference between a short story and a novel, and you will be able to learn about important writers and texts in the course of this discussion. So let's have a look at the next slide, where we'll start looking at these two forms in a greater detail. So let's have a look at the next slide.
The novel and the short story are two most popular literary genres. The word genre or genre comes from the French, originally Latin word for kind or class. The term widely used in rhetoric, literary theory, media theory, and more recently linguistics to refer to distinctive type of a text. This means that genre refers to a type of text.
Anil, what is interesting is the term genre and the pronunciation of the term genre, and we have seen that students confuse how to pronounce the word genre, and we have got two acceptable ways of pronouncing the word genre. One is genre as a British way of pronouncing, and there is genre. So there are American and British pronunciation of the same term, and the term implies class, what we can say in Gujarati as a prakar of text. The text might be a film one, or it might be the oral one, or it might be a written printed one. The type or prakar is what genre implies. So short story and novel are two genres. So let's have a closer look at what do we mean by narrative. We have heard this word often. Narrative is a story that is created in a constructive format as a work of speech, writing, song, film, television, video games, photography, or theater. And it describes a sequence of fictional or non-fictional event. So narrative is basically a story, Anil.
Oh yes, or we could even say it's the progression of the story as the story develops, as the story moves. The other thing which becomes very important is that within a short story or a novel, you have both a story and the plot.
Right.
There's a very minor difference between the two, but many a time students, in a way, get confused between the two.
Right.
A story tells us about the progression, that is what happened next. That is, if I could give you an example, once there was a king and there was a queen, the king died and then the queen died.
Right.
Now there's this progression. This is a story. But then if you're talking about a plot, you could say that once there was a king and a queen, the king died, and the queen died because of the grief of the king's death. which means that it gives you a reason, a cause and effect. Plot generally talks about cause and effect, whereas a story talks about a progression as to what happened next.
I think this is a very interesting example given by E.M. Foster that you are telling. It's in his very famous theoretical work called Aspects of Novel, where he distinguishes between a story and plot. What do you mean by plot? So story implies just sequence, while plot implies cause-effect relationship between two events. Let's have a look at the next slide. Fiction.
The form of any narrative or informative work that deals in part or in whole with the information or events that are not factual but rather imaginary, that is invented by the author.
So the most important part of fiction is that it is different from factual narrative, or it's very different from informative narrative. So fiction implies imaginary or invented story. It's something like what we call kalpanik, and it's invention of author's own imagination. And so fiction is a very important term that we should keep in mind while we look at both fictional forms, short story and the novel. So let's have a look at the next slide where we look into the forms. Fiction versus non-fiction.
So fiction also refers to the theoretical, cinematic and musical work. Fiction contrasts with non-fiction, which deals exclusively with factual or at least actual functions or facts, events, descriptions, like you find in the histories or you find in the biographies.
Yeah, so Anil, fictional and non-fictional distinction is very important. Fiction is kalpanic and non-fictional would include works like travelogues, biographical works, autobiographies, which are assumed to be factual. They may or may not be factual, but at the same time, the readers as well as writers assume that this is not imaginary, but something which has really happened. So that's, on the other hand, novels or short story which are fictional are purely imaginary. They have not actually happened, and the people are not real people in the sense that you meet them on the street.
But at the same time, if it could be added, we could say that even though it is a fiction, it's not true, but then it should be lifelike. That is, the reader should be able to associate the story with incidents that he sees around or that he has experienced. Or the characters again should look or seem to be like the characters he has known in real life, or they should seem to be lifelike characters, so that he can associate with those incidents.
Right. The whole very idea of resemblance or similarity with actual life and a fictional work, imaginary work, is often called mimesis by theorists. So mimesis is a very important aspect of fiction. Let's have a look at the next slide where we look at the term short story.
The term short story tells us that it is a narrative story and that it is short. So short story means a short piece of narrative.
However, short is a relative term. For example, consider sentences like my brother is shorter than me, but I am shorter than my friend. So word short is a very relative term. We cannot really define what is short, and it can be only understood in relation to other forms of prose narratives like novel, the novella, the novelette, or flash fiction. And all these divisions are largely in terms of the length of it, length of a narrative. Short, how short is short or how long is long is a difficult question. You cannot really pin down that this is short and this is long, because it's in relation to something that we call something as long and short. And that is a real confusion for many students, because they often think novel is a longer version of a short story. The distinction can be, I think, Anil, very fruitfully compared to T20, 2020 game, yes, and a test match. Two different forms of same game. Let's have a look at the next slide. The short story. The American Heritage Dictionary of English Language defines short story as a short piece of prose fiction, having few characters and aiming at unity of effect.
This definition, Sachin, very clearly tells us that it's not always about length.
Yeah.
Because when you're talking about a short story, the short story compresses the entire incident in such a way that it discusses only one plot or one character at a time. It does not encompass the entire social, let's say, canvas at the same time that a novel can do. And it talks about incidents or characters in a given situation, and it completes the entire story in that, let's say, very short span of time. You could even say that a short story should be so short that it could be read in one sitting. That could be one of the, let's say, ways of looking at it.
That is one of the definitions which Edgar Allan Poe, whom we are going to look at more closely in the course of our discussion, defines short story as. But very interesting thing about this discussion is the idea of unity of effect and impression. That there is some singular impression that short story conveys, unlike a novel which has, as you rightly pointed out, a wide range of characters, incidents, and a larger canvas that the novel has. So that's a very important point that you mentioned. Let's have a look at the next slide here.
Because of the shorter length, a short story usually focuses on one plot, one main character with a few additional minor characters and one central theme, whereas a novel can tackle multiple plots and themes with a variety of prominent characters.
So that's the distinction we discuss right now.
Yes. And Sachin, if you could exemplify as to what are, let's say, minor characters and major characters, because it's going to benefit the students of undergraduate. So if you could tell them more about what are, let's say, major characters and minor characters, and what does single plot and multiple plot mean?
Very interesting. Actually, novels usually consist of multiple plots. There is one main plot and there is a subplot or minor plot, and the protagonists and the main characters of the main plot are the main characters, and the minor plots revolve around minor characters. So a novel usually is divided into major characters and minor characters. If you consider an example like, say, Wuthering Heights, very famous novel by Emily Bronte, then the main characters are Catherine and Heathcliff. These are the main characters. At the same time, there are narrators like Nellie Dean, and these are minor characters who tell the story. So there is a plot story of Heathcliff and Catherine, and on the other hand there are other minor characters. So a novel may have multiple plots and stories and multiple characters.
And again, as you mentioned E.M. Foster before, E.M. Foster divides them into flat character and a round character. A round character, a major character, is a character who develops with the story, or the story develops with him. Whereas the minor character is a character that generally remains at the same stage from the beginning of the story to the very end.
Exactly. The round character, as you rightly pointed out, is about transformation and change that occurs in the main characters, and flat characters would be the characters which remain untransformed throughout the storyline. So that's a very important thing. Let's look at the slide that where we'll discuss the history of the short story. William Boyd, in A Short History of Short Story, notes the short story had always existed as an informal oral tradition, but until the mass middle class literacy of the 19th century arrived in the West and the magazine and periodical market was invented to service the new reading public's desires and preferences, there had been no real publishing forum for a piece of short fiction in the 5 to 50 pages range. So William Boyd, you can say, Anil, is focusing on the sociology and the anthropology of the evolution of short story, and he is talking about the origins of short story, and he says that the earliest versions of short story would be the oral tradition, Kanthastha Parampara, like we have in Panchatantra, and the folklore. These are the oral traditions that we had. But only with the rise of middle class literacy, when people were able to read and write and they had leisure to read and write, there was this rise in periodical market. Periodicals are journals, literary journals, newspapers, etc. When they were actually prominent in the culture, there then arose the platform for a short version of a story, printed written short story to emerge as a literary form. So you can see that it's in 19th century that short story really arise, the modern short story. So you can actually contrast modern short story with the folk and oral short story.
Sure, Sachin, because all of us like to listen to stories, and from our early childhood we have been listening to stories, and even our ancestors from, let's say, a very long time, ever since they started socializing, and probably ever since the invention of language, they must have told stories to each other.
Yeah.
But at the same time, story as a literary form could not develop as, until the society was, let's say, literate enough, or until the society needed such stories to read during their leisure, as you mentioned. So again, a literary story as a form of, let's say, art, or as a form of literature, developed because of these social needs. Whereas the oral tradition has been with us for a very long time. Even in, let's say, 7th century, it was said that Kadambari can be seen as, let's say, a series of stories, or even the Persian form of Dastan may be seen as, let's say, stories. But then the modern short story is, let's say, a way ahead, more developed, and more artistic. In a theoretical sense of the word.
Very true. So these are very important aspects about how social changes actually impact literary forms and their origins and their transformation in the form. So short story, the contemporary modern short story, emerged out of social changes of 19th century. Let's have a look at the next slide, where William Boyd talks about the early short story in the West, and he says that Walter Scott's short story, The Two Drovers, published in the Chronicles of the Canongate in 1827, is the first modern short story. The emphasis is on the word modern short story, as distinguished from the oral and the folk short story. Scott influenced George Eliot and Thomas Hardy in Britain, Balzac in France, Pushkin and Turgenev in Russia, and Fenimore Cooper and Hawthorne in America. These writers in turn influenced Flaubert, Maupassant in France, Anton Chekhov in Russia, Poe and Melville in America. So we have an entire history of short story forms in Britain, Russia, America, France, and we see that this is a very popular form handled by some of the masters of fiction like Hardy, Eliot, Balzac, Pushkin, Hawthorne, Flaubert, Maupassant, and of course Anton Chekhov, who is one of the most influential short story writers ever, probably. So let's have a look at the next slide, where we see the picture of Anton Chekhov, a Russian short story writer, playwright, and physician, and is considered to be one of the greatest short story writers in the history of world literature. Anil, I'm reminded of a very famous short story that I taught at some level called The Misery. Where there is this cab driver, this horse car driver, who lost his son. His son is no more, he is dead, and he has nobody to tell about his grief and his misery. So he tries to strike up a conversation with his passengers, all types of passengers, and nobody is really interested in listening to his grief and his misery. So at the end of the day, he is so much disturbed by the whole thing that he finally tells the story to the horse, the mare. So in some way, Chekhov's story about an individual who cannot share his grief with anyone, and in some way, it's a story about a story.
Oh, sure.
This is how story emerges, right? When individual has nobody to share, and it's the loss of this community and social bonding that is connected to the rise of modern novel that Frank O'Connor talks about when we look at him in detail. So
again, the example that you give reminds me that it's the urge to narrate, or it's the urge to say that makes a writer, let's say, write a short story. Because he has a story that wants to come out, and that becomes very important, whereas a short story is concerned. Whereas in a novel, it's a more methodological sort of a thing, where a writer should have more patience and should, let's say, make it more artistic, let's say, when he's following the form, when he's writing about it. And a novel takes, let's say, many a times a year, 2 years, 3 years. Whereas a short story, let's say, it flows out. Because there is something inside the inner urge of the
there is
writer.
Some element of spontaneity, and, inner urge,
as we may find in various subjective poems as well.
Right, exactly. So let's have a look at the next slide, where we have, as we said, Edgar Allan Poe, one of the earliest important theorists of short story as a form. And when Edgar Allan Poe read Hawthorne, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and both of them are very important American writers, and he made the first real analysis of the difference between short story and the novel. And he defines short story quite simply as a narrative, as you mentioned, Anil, that can be read at one sitting. William Boyd takes Poe's definition further by saying a true, fully functioning short story should achieve a totality of effect that makes it almost impossible to encapsulate or summarize. So the effect which short story conveys is very different from the effect that a novel conveys, and it's this effect which is of very importance to us as students of literature, because it's these two effects that we have to pay attention to. And this Edgar Allan Poe's almost classic definition of short story.
Oh yes, and Edgar Allan Poe becomes very important because he was the pioneer, so among the pioneers who started theorizing story,
Right.
who started thinking as to what a story is as a literary form. And many a times students are told that Edgar Allan Poe is the father of modern story, which is not entirely true. But at the same time, he was amongst the pioneers who started thinking about the short story as a literary form and
Right.
started defining it, distinguishing it from other forms.
Other forms. Yes.
Here again, a very important thing, as Boyd says, as you say, that it is encapsulate or cannot be encapsulated or
Yeah.
cannot be summarized.
Summarized.
That again tells us that it is so compressed an art that you cannot summarize it in a line or two, or you cannot summarize it in a, let's say, few lines, as you can do
Right.
with the novel.
Yeah. So short story is very difficult to paraphrase because the effect that it conveys is not really about the plot, but it seems to be the overall impression, the totality, which Boyd so rightly points out. So, and Edgar Allan Poe, as we all know, is also one of the earliest of horror and detective form, very popular formats
Yes.
in fiction.
And at the same time, he even vouched for art's sake. And he said that a story should be about story. If I remember one of his stories, The Fall of the House of Usher, a very important story that again tells us more about the narration, how the narration moves forward. And it's a story that tells us about, let's say, a brother and sister who live alone in a very big mansion. And the writer who is invited there to be with them, he spends a night with them. He is there and he sees the horror that they are going through. This mansion is in a place which is very far away removed from the society. And as this story moves forward, you come to know that the entire mansion also falls. Here again, most important thing is that Edgar Allan Poe is writing this story about writing a story and
Right.
not about a society that he depicts in it. Whereas in a novel, you generally talk about the society that is around you. So in a way, you could say that Edgar Allan Poe even initiated the metafiction that we see today.
So let's go further, and we have this picture of Edgar Allan Poe here, who was an American author, poet, and critic. Considered as part of American Romantic movement, Poe was one of the earliest practitioners and theorists of short story. And later on, this tradition of American theorizing of fiction was again taken further by Henry James, and his Art of Fiction is one of the most earliest and most important statements on the subject. So let's look at this distinction between short story and the novel, and what Boyd has to say about it.
Boyd says that the effect of reading a good short story is quite different from the effect of reading a good novel. The great modern short stories possess a quality of mystery and beguiling resonance about them, a complexity of afterthought that cannot be pinned down or analyzed.
Yeah, so what Boyd seems to be saying, Anil, is that the impression or the effect or the impact which the short story leaves on the reader is very difficult to capture in words or state what exactly it is. There is this quality of mystery and resonance about it, and there is a complexity, and all this is owing to the compression and concentration of a literary form as against elaboration and extension of narrative in the novel. So we have two different impacts that they create upon us.
Again, Henry James once said that a short story writer is like a man who has 2 pennies or 2 coins and if he can, let's say, do without spending the second, he won't do it.
Exactly.
So he'll be as economical as he has to be, both with words and with thought.
Right. Now let's look at a very important theorist of short story, again an Irish writer who has almost 150 works, and his name is Frank O'Connor, and he is known for his short stories and memoirs. His most famous work is The Lonely Voice in 1963, and this is one of very important statements on short story as a literary form, and as the title suggests, it's the lonely voice. So the voice of a loner is what short story is all about. So that's what makes it very important form. What he has to say, let's have a look. There is in the short story, says Frank O'Connor, at its most characteristic purpose, something that we do not find in the novel, an intense awareness of human loneliness. The story, O'Connor points out, deals with the submerged population groups consisting of outlawed figures wandering about the fringes of society. So I'm reminded again of Anton Chekhov's horse cart driver, who is actually an isolated, marginalized figure, and his loneliness there is no one to share. So short story is about individuals who are on the margins of the society, who really don't have a voice in the matter, and these are the people whose lonely voice story tries to capture. And this is a very important way of looking at short story. So you can compare short story with the rise of individualism in the West.
Oh yes, and it is one of the, let's say, greatest subjective forms we find in prose.
Right.
Whereas in verse you have various forms which are very subjective, closer to the heart and emotion. Whereas in, let's say, the prosaic form or in prose, you find the short story that talks about the subjectivity, the feeling, or the inner urge to express oneself. When he says that he is a loner, again, not exactly as a loner in the society, but a loner who thinks that his views cannot be told to the others, just as you, let's say, mentioned the horse cart driver,
right,
who thinks that there is nobody to listen to my story, and so I should pen it down, so that I should write it down. And writing that story down relieves him of, let's say, that inner urge.
Right.
You could even compare him with the, let's say, let's say, Rime of the Ancient Mariner.
Right.
Whereas the Ancient Mariner has this inner urge to narrate his story, and there's no one to, let's say, hear that story.
Exactly.
Once you find someone to listen to that story, you are, let's say, out of that imprisonment.
Exactly.
Out of yourself. So that inner urge is very important, and a short story writer, very subjectively, let's say, describes that inner urge with using the compressed form in prose, that is the short story.
So what is interesting, Anil, here is that earlier oral traditions and oral narratives, they had somebody who could listen to the stories. There were listeners, there was an audience, so there were people in this face-to-face kind of social setup, amne samne, whereas a person can tell a story and somebody was there to listen to him. So what happened with the rise of industrialism and modernity is the collapse of these face-to-face communities. And short story is about, in some way, collapse of this face-to-face community, and so it's very different, according to O'Connor, from the oral narrative forms.
Oh yes, and as you said, there are sociological reasons that are more important for the development of the short story.
Right.
Because just as a writer wants to communicate, even the reader wants to imbibe and communicate his feelings.
Right.
And he may not find in that disintegrating society during industrialization, he may not find people who will give him, let's say, lend him, let's say, a patient ear to listen. And that is why he finds in that short story his own expressions, or his or her own views expressed. And that is why the short story became, again, a very important, let's say, form of literature that developed very fast, because short story could be read in a short span of time. Every week in those journals or in those newspapers, every day you could find different short stories, and you could find people who could relate to them in a very short span of time. Whereas if you're reading a novel, you need to devote more time to reading a novel and to understanding that novel.
Right.
Whereas
Right.
a short story does not require understanding to that extent, because it is, let's say, the imbibing of the short story, the total effect of the short story, which becomes
Exactly.
more important. And so the short story affects directly to the subjective reader and both to the
Right.
subjective, let's say, writer.
Right, and I think a very interesting example can be found in Indian context where you can actually see how Frank O'Connor's argument stands valid. Is the story of Kabuliwala by Rabindranath Tagore, where Kabuliwala is a dry fruit seller, a marginal fringe figure on the society, and his relation with the girl of a very respectable family, a small girl whom he gives dry fruits every time he meets, and then one fine day he is actually thrown out.
Yeah.
And his loneliness and his agony and his inability to relate to the grown-up girl at the time of her marriage
Yeah.
is something what Frank O'Connor means by the lonely voice.
Oh yes, sure.
Let's have
A very
look.
good example.
Yeah.
Go on.
Yeah. One of the most important aspects of the short story as a genre, according to Frank O'Connor, is its focus on the individual and his or her loneliness and social marginality, is what we talked about Kabuliwala and the horse cart driver. Connor also notes the modern short story begins and continues to function as a private art, intended to satisfy the standards of the individual, solitary and critical reader. The novel, on the other hand, emphasizes the process of identification between reader and the character, according to Frank O'Connor.
A very good definition.
Let's now look at the novel as a form, and let us compare a novel with the short story again. The novel, in Gujarati we call it Naval Katha, is an extended prose fictional narrative of around 50,000 words or more, which arose in the late 17th and early 18th century and overtook verse narratives. Narratives are the stories told in a poetic verse format in popularity and eventually replaced them. Its roots go back to medieval and early modern romance and the tradition of the novella. The latter supplied the present generic term in the late 18th century. So word novel comes from novella in Italian. And here Anil, you can see that very interestingly, prose narrative, prose fiction replaced the verse narrative, which was oral, and thus it emerged as a new form, and the older forms became more marginal. So you can see how as society changes, literary forms are also transformed.
Oh yes, they have to adapt to the changes, and novel is one of the forms which has very, let's say, nicely adapted to the changing forms, and that is why today you have more number of novels written as compared to, let's say, the drama or poems or other genres that we talked about earlier.
Right. So let's look at this more closely. Let's look at the term romance that we mentioned in the earlier slide. And word romance is liable to create a misunderstanding among students who associate it only with love affair or something like that. But the romance is a technical term to describe a medieval narrative genre, and it is precursor of the novel. Written at first in verse, as in the works of Chatillon de Troyes, and later in prose, Malory's La Morte d'Arthur. The romances were popular in the aristocratic, rich upper-class circle of high medieval and early Europe. They were fantastic stories about marvel-filled adventures, often of a knight-errant portrayed as having heroic quality who goes on a quest. So they were also called chivalric romances. Now, chivalry implies a certain institution in medieval Madhyakal Europe, where you find the stories of knights or the sardars, the knights, and adventures of those knights against various demons and enemies and so on. So romances often dealt with stories of knights and very improbable and romantic and fantastic stories that romance is told. So novel replaced this form of romance. So let's have a look how it did. The term novel in most of the European languages is roman, which suggests closeness to medieval roman. So in many European languages, novel is called roman. The English name, however, is derived from Italian novella, meaning a little new thing. Romances and novels, short stories, short tales in prose were predecessors of the novel, as were the picaresque narrative. So Anil, let's look at this picaresque narrative, which emerged out of the collapse of romance, how romance became less and less popular and picaresque replaced that. So let's have a look at what is meant by picaresque.
Just a moment before that, if I could say, Sajjan, if we could take it back, let's say to even before the medieval times, in the ancient times, you have mythological characters,
Right.
who, let's say, perform all these adventures, who, let's say, move on these adventurous errands. Later on in the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, in the Middle Ages, you find them replaced by the knights
Right.
and their errantries. But then they were expressed in, let's say, poetry.
Right.
Whereas in, let's say, 18th century onwards, when the novel replaces it, and even the, let's say, picaresque novel or the picar replaces it, you find that human beings or human characters replace those mythological gods, which were replaced by, let's say, the knights, were replaced by these rogues.
Right.
Again, these rogue character was a character which, let's say, went on different errands, went on, let's say, adventures from one place to the other.
Right.
And at the same time, it's the story of their adventures, and with their adventure, the story moves forward.
Right. And picaresque word comes from let's look at the slide. The picaresque novel. The picaro is Spanish word for rogue, and the typical picaresque story is of the escapades of a rascal, as you rightly pointed out, who lives by his wits. So what we have here is that knights being replaced by rascals, and this shift actually indicates the outlook which has changed from anthropocentric, more idealized worldview of Renaissance that you have to more human, more realistic way of looking at life, and that's why rascal becomes the central character, replacing the knight. So that the whole outlook towards life seems to have changed, and how this shift in outlook has given rise to new literary form. The development of the realistic novel owes much to the such works, which were written to deflate romantic or idealized fictional form. So fictional forms which dealt with romance, the idealization of bravery of knights and their glory and their great adventures and heroism, were replaced by people who were actually rascals or non-heroic or anti-heroic. And we have at this juncture a very important novel, Anil, by Cervantes, that we are going to discuss now. So let's have a look at the next slide, where we look at a very important picaresque novel called Don Quixote. Cervantes, who wrote Don Quixote, is the story of engaging madman who tries to live by the ideals of chivalric romance, explores the role of illusion and reality in life, and was one of the single most important progenitors of modern novel. Don Quixote's story is one of the very important precursors to modern novel, because in some way it is a novel, as you said, about the novel, and how the main character is actually addicted to reading chivalric romances, and he feels that he is also a knight while he is just a commoner, and the whole chivalry, institution of chivalry, is no more. So he is actually anachronistic. He lives out of his times. He feels that there are still adventures waiting for him, and there is still this chivalry waiting for him. So Don Quixote goes out for his adventures or misadventures. And very interesting misadventure is when he thinks that the windmill is actually a demon, and so he tries to actually kill the windmill. And so this gives rise to the phrase called tilting at the windmills, where you fight the imaginary demon. So modern man, unlike the pre-modern man, is fighting imaginary demons all the time. And this is what Don Quixote's misadventures seems to point out.
Again, very important thing in this novel, Sachin, could be that the protagonist comes out of the novel and becomes the character himself, or tries to imagine that he is the character, and he probably becomes the knight or the, let's say, person who goes on these misadventures, as you say. But the entire edifice of the novel again falls, just as you find in modern novels, where the entire edifice of the novel towards the end many a times falls on itself. Here again, towards the end, he says that nobody will read any more novels now. The novel here ends with that sort of a suggestion, where he says that now I won't be reading any novel now, because that novel makes the reader identify with the protagonist to such an extent that he may go on to those misadventures, which here it very clearly, let's say, points out. Whereas in the short story, as you had earlier said, it's more about the total impression or the total impact, and it's less about identifying with the character, it's more about identifying with the incidents more about identifying with the story and its progression.
Exactly.
That's the main difference between the two.
Right, very right. So let's move further and let's look at the history of novel in closer detail. The novel is often said to have emerged with the appearance of Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe in 1719 and Moll Flanders in 1722. The first novel of character or psychological novel is Samuel Richardson's Pamela, 1740 to 41, an epistolatory novel, a novel in which the story is conveyed entirely by the exchange of letters. It's a very popular device that you find in so many novels. A letter is seen to advance the story. It is the work characterized by the careful plotting of emotional states. Another such important work is Richardson's masterpiece Clarissa. What you see, Anil, is that adventures seem to have moved inside. It's no longer the knight's adventures in the world out there, but what is going on in here seems to be the focus of what is known as psychological novel or the novel of character, as it's said. And the term epistolatory also is a very important term for the students of literature because as a term it's often asked in exam, what is epistolatory novel, where the novel is actually using letter as a kind of device to advance the plot.
Again, as you said very rightly, that here the, let's say, action moves from the physical action to the psychological action.
Right.
Whereas it's not an errand in the outside world. It's more of an errand inward.
Exactly.
Psychologically, what let's say character thinks. Another thing that the students might find very interesting, maybe that Samuel Richardson owned a printing press, and he wanted to, let's say, tell his audience or the people in England as to how they should write good letters. And this was the time when, let's say, the mail service had started, the postal service had started, and in England, and he actually wanted to tell them or write a book about how to write good letters. He started with that, and then he thought that he would need some characters who will be writing letters to some other character. And as it developed, it became the first English novel or the first English psychological novel. Right. And many people even say that Samuel Richardson is the father of English novel in that sense. But again, students should see that the psychological novel started with Samuel Richardson, but even before him, there have been, let's say, books or works that come very close to the definition of the novel.
Yes, we saw Daniel Defoe and Robinson Crusoe. We can also think of Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan.
Oh, yes.
Or you can also think of Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift as early precursors of the novel. So let's move ahead. And let's look at a very important theorist of novel, and whom we are going to contrast with Frank O'Connor's discussion that we had about the lonely voice. Yes. And this theorist is the Russian theorist and a philosopher known Mikhail Bakhtin. And what he has to say about the novel. Mikhail Bakhtin, 1895 to 1975, was a Russian philosopher, literary critic and scholar who worked on literary theory, ethics and philosophy of language. So this is the picture of very important theorist of novel called Mikhail Bakhtin. So let's have a look what he has to say about the novel.
In epic and novel, Bakhtin points out the novel's distinct nature by contrasting it with the epic. He shows that the novel is well suited to the post-industrial civilization in which we live because it flourishes on diversity. It is the same diversity that the epic attempts to eliminate from the world. A very, let's say, important definition, which tells us about the methodology that the two different forms use. If you look at the epic looks at the world in a more uniform sort of a way. Whereas in an epic, it's generally, let's say, the conflict between the good and the bad. And you could be either with the good or the bad. There is no gray area or patch that, let's say, you have. It is either you are white or black. There can't be anything gray. Whereas when you're talking about the novel is multi-dimensional in that way. And it gives a legroom to, let's say, various views or various sorts of people within the society. It does not only talk about two types of people or two types of ideologies. That is the good or the bad, which you find in most of the epics.
So very interestingly, Anil, is here Bakhtin is comparing novel with epic. Both of these are narrative forms of extended length. Epic often relies on verse and novel often relies on prose, though it's not necessary that novel is always in prose. You have exceptions like Vikram Sheth's novel a Golden Gate, which is written in a sonnet form. But even then, the novel can be contrasted fruitfully with epic. And what you find is that, as you rightly pointed out, that epic is about synthesis of black versus white, right versus wrong. It's the uniform, the totalizing impact of epic. While novel deals with the in-between, good and the bad, right and the wrong. So it gives rise to multi-dimensional perspectives and multiple voices that Bakhtin will discuss, and that's what he means by diversity. Let's look at his discussion in greater detail. Bakhtin on the novel says that the novel as a genre is unique in that it is able to embrace, ingest and devour other genres while still maintaining its status as a novel. The other genres, however, cannot emulate the novel without damaging their own distinctive identity. This is a very interesting insight. Novel is seen as something which eats up other forms, like short story, like epic, like poetry, like all other literary drama. Novel seems to consume, eat, ingest, digest multiple forms without losing its identity, because probably it has no identity. But at the same time, short story cannot do the same.
Oh yes.
Drama cannot do what novel is doing. So novel's distinctiveness lies in its ability to eat up other forms. That is what Bakhtin is saying.
The example that you gave from Vikram Seth is one of the examples how, let's say, the verse form was used in, let's say, a novel, as a novel. So again, you see that it has eaten up or taken or imbibed or, let's say, gulped down, swallowed, let's say, the verse form or the poetry form.
Right.
Again, you could use poetic language in, let's say, a novel. You could use the dialogue format in a novel. But then in a drama, you cannot, let's say, have extended narration.
Exactly.
Again, in poetry, you cannot use extended, let's say, prose. There are prose, let's say, poems, which are more prosaic. You have a poet with us here. But then at the same time, let's say, novel has emerged and developed primarily because it has, let's say, engulfed all the forms that have come its way. Exactly. And it has changed and evolved with all those forms. And that is why the novel that we had at the earliest time and the novel that we have today have some things in common, and they are still very far apart and very different from each other.
Right. So this tendency of the novel is a form to eat up other forms, gobble up other forms. The version, as you pointed out, was Vikram Seth's, but the earliest version of poetic novels or novel in verse was Pushkin's Eugene Onegin. It's a Russian novel. I don't know how to exactly pronounce it, but Pushkin's novel is written in a verse format. So novel seems to be eating up everything that comes within its reach, and at the same time remain a novel. So it seems to be a huge bag, as somebody defined, that where you can put in anything that you want to put in.
Even Canterbury Tales by Chaucer can be called as, let's say, verse narratives, because they narrate a story.
Right.
Though technically they do not come very close to the novel as you see it in that sense. But then there have been novels written which can be divided into various parts. Right. And if you, let's say, see the progression of all these stories, and if you combine all of them, compile all of them, you have, let's say, various voices of the 14th century that you can see in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Right. And it's a, let's say, narrative in the verse format.
Right. So talking of voices that you might point out, let's see what Bakhtin has to say about this. And he uses the term, let's look at the next slide, where he uses the very important term heteroglossia. In this slide, heteroglossia means any language in Bakhtin's view stratifies into many voices. What do you say, Ariel? Multiple voices. The social dialects, characteristic group behavior, professional jargons like that of doctor or engineer or lawyer, generic languages, languages of generations and age groups like slang on the street, tendentious languages, languages of the authorities of various cycles and passing fashion. So within a language you have many languages, and this multiple language within a language is what Bakhtin means by heteroglossia, having many languages within a language. And he's talking about diversity in language, Vaividya, Bhasha Vaividya, variety of language that he means. This is the heterogeneous language of language, what Bakhtin calls heteroglossia. Glossia means tongue, hetero means multiple. So within a language you have many languages, and this is what novel seems to be addressing here. So Bakhtin says the linguistic energy of the novel is in its expression of the conflict between voices through their adaptation to different elements in the novel's discourse. This diversity of voice is the defining characteristic of novel as a genre. So novel seems to be not just eating up many forms, it's also about multiple forms of language, many genres of language, what Bakhtin calls speech genres. So many genres are actually encompassed or devoured by the novel, and that is what gives it its energy.
That's what makes it multi-dimensional.
Right. So let's now, towards the end, compare and contrast the novel and short story as form. As both the forms are prose narrative, the basic elements of narrative like characterization, plot, points of view, and setting are common. However, comparing Bakhtin's view on novel and Frank O'Connor's and Boyd's views on the short story, we realize that difference between short story and the novel is not simply the length of the story. So short story is not a novel cut in short, nor is novel an extension of short story, but these two are two different formats, and though they use the basic elements like characterization, plot, point of view, they are primarily not similar, they are different. And the overall emphasis and the focus of short story seems to be towards the individual and his or her isolation, as Connor points out in The Lonely Voice. And the overall emphasis and the focus of the novel seems to be on the plurality and social diversity of conflicting voice. What you say is multidimensionality of society is what novel, the energy of novel comes from. So this is a very interesting and fruitful way of distinguishing these two. Let's have a look at Boyd and what he says about this distinction. As a writer and as a theorist, he says that something occurs in writing and reading of a short story that is of another level from reading and writing a novel. The basic issue, as you, Anil, pointed out earlier, is that of compression versus expansion. We see that the ideas, the inspiration, that the will drive a novel, however succinctly expressed, have to be capable of endless augmentation and elaboration. There is this centrifugal element in the novel which goes away from the center, and there is centripetal movement in the short story where there is a movement towards the center.
In order to make it more clearer to the students, we could say that a novelist keeps on adding something to the story in order to, let's say, lengthen it, in order to take it, let's say, further. Right. Whereas a short story writer keeps on extracting those things which a short story can do without. Right. So anything that is not necessary for the story should not be a part of the story. Right. Whereas in a novel, a novelist can, let's say, go on describing a scene or, let's say, nature for 2 pages, 3 pages. Whereas, let's say, a novelist does not have that leisure or that, let's say, facility or that faculty.
Right. What do you say that 2 pennies and that you have in your pocket, and a short story writer won't spend the next one if it's possible by one. And this is the picture of William Boyd, a very important Scottish novelist and screenwriter whom we have discussed. And what he says as essence of almost all stories is one of distillation and of reduction. As you said, distillation is a very important word. It's not a simple question of length. There are 20 pages short stories and there are far more charged and brave than 400 pages novel. He says we are talking about a different category of prose fiction altogether, and he contrasts very fruitfully between lyric and epic as being parallel to novel and short story. I think this is a very convenient parallel for students to understand that just like a lyric is different from epic, short story is different from novel.
From the novel.
So I think this discussion actually must have helped students to make this very critical distinction between these various genres.
And one thing that the students might have learned probably is that it's not the length that matters. It's the treatment that becomes more important. That differentiates a short story from a novel.
Right. So we would like to thank Baizak Sandan for giving us an opportunity to be here and make a presentation. And we would also like to thank the students for listening to us so patiently. So thank you.
We hope it was meaningful and helpful.
Yeah, let's hope so.